Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today, we're heading to the Washington coast to revisit a beach hike led by former U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas.
This is Justice Douglas coming down the steps of the Supreme Court building to meet some other people who are going along on the hike.
That 1958 protest excursion was part of an effort to prevent a highway from cutting through what's now part of Olympic National Park. But this hike was truly the brainchild of another environmental advocate, Polly Dyer, who made many vital contributions to wilderness preservation in the West. If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting and more relevant. You can find the video in the show notes. But for now, cinch up those packs and let's hit the trail. Knut, I understand you were a high school fan of Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. Why?
Well, I was. I mean, this was during the 60s, right? And issues about civil liberties were sort of front and center for me.
Several thousand students have gathered.
And William O. Douglas had written a book called Points of Rebellion, in which he was essentially defending the protest movement in part. And, writing a manifesto, basically, about the importance of civil liberties in this country. And I was inspired by this book, thought it was fabulous. So I wrote him a fan letter. Just, William O. Douglas, Washington, Supreme Court, Washington, D.C.
Just way to go, William O.
Yeah, basically, yes. Just, I loved your book. Thank you for writing it. It was a very short book. It was more of a tract, really. But also it was at a time when there were very few members of the so-called establishment who were articulating these opinions. You had lots of activists and radicals and others, but here was somebody who'd been on the court since the Roosevelt administration.
The right to freedom of speech is not limited. Under some governments, they have a limitation. The freedom of speech is subject to reasonable regulation by the legislature. But under our First Amendment, there are no qualifications.
And I did know that he was from Washington State, that he grew up in Yakima, was an avid outdoorsman and conservationist. So I was aware of that at the time.
Was that part of your admiration that he was from this state and he was an outdoors person?
Yeah, he was one of us, So I was just proud of the fact that he was standing up for our rights. And strange enough, months later, I received a little white envelope that was from the Supreme Court and had typed on the front, on the return address, WOD. And I was a stamp collector back in the day, and I noticed the postmark, and the postmark said Goose Prairie, Washington. And I remember asking my mother, where's Goose Prairie? And, she said, well, that's where he stays when the court's not in session. It's basically he has a summer home there.
So you got a letter from a Supreme Court justice while he was on vacation.
Yes. And of course, was he ever really on vacation? Yeah. I mean, he was an avid hiker, traveler. And, he wrote many books about what the Northwest environment meant to him. But more importantly for me at that time was his stance on the Supreme Court in favor of civil liberties.
You don't think this constitutes any danger to our society or our government?
Probably the biggest danger throughout history is not being able to talk.
Well, I wrote a letter to John F. Kennedy in 1962 about the Cuban Missile Crisis because I was freaked out, and I did get a response back from one of his aides, and I remember coming home from school and everybody was lined up, my parents and my brothers, with this letter going, you have a letter from the White House. I did carry it with me for a while.
That's great.
Was William O. Douglas at this time considered a radical?
I don't think he was considered radical, but he was certainly known for his commitment to civil rights. He was probably better known for his commitment to the wilderness.
Do you have any upcoming projects, any mountain climbing or long hikes?
To protecting the last parts of unblemished or natural America. And that was a passion that came from his youth, where he was hiking in the Cascades. As an adult, he had a little fish camp over on the Washington coast. He had his cabin up at Goose Prairie, which is just east of Mount Rainier.
Well, no, nothing particular in mind. I do a lot of exercise, outdoor hiking and climbing, although I discover as the years go by that the mountains are getting a bit steeper.
Did you know about this 1958 beach hike that we are going to talk about when you wrote him the letter?
No, I did not know about the beach hike at all. It wasn't something I learned about until actually years later.
What was the impetus for creating this revisit, this episode?
We do an episode or two every season looking back at feedback or something that we learned after we ran. And so this episode was actually the Mossback December special, half-hour special that we did on the wild Northwest. And it was we strung together a bunch of Mossback episodes about the wilderness and our history of that and wild animals and stuff. Oversized bison, mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths. These were the wildlife here 10,000 years ago. And I had read a wonderful book by Margaret McKeon, who is a federal judge, and she wrote a book-length appreciation called Citizen Justice, The Environmental Legacy of William O. Douglas. And his passion for Washington and the Pacific Northwest, his passion for the environment, really struck me. And I thought, well, I could tell people about Douglas's involvement. William O. Douglas was one of the 20th century's most influential U.S. Supreme Court justices. And I could show maybe some footage from this beach hike. We could show that, and it would just sort of tie the episode together. In the 1950s, he led a group of activists and enthusiastic hikers down the wild Pacific coast of Washington. Well, after it came out and ran, I got a message from a man who's very involved with the North Cascades Conservation Council. And he said that he had found this film in the basement of one of the founders of the North Cascades Conservation Council. And it turned out the film was really badly degraded. He contacted another filmmaker and said, "What do you know about this film?" And the guy said, the filmmaker, a guy named Louis Huber, who was mainly a maker of Alaskan wildlife films that used to air on TV, like Northwest Adventure or whatever, had gone on this hike with William O. Douglas, made a color film, it's narrated, and he had donated his films to the Oregon Historical Society. They found this one very significant historically. They got a grant. They had it completely restored, and they put it on YouTube. And so anybody now can go see this little documentary about this famous beach hike.
I was one of the cameramen who went along, and I'm going to tell you about the hike as I saw it.
So it's really an orphan film. It's a
Yes.
one-time project, and then it was forgotten and left in a box and then resurrected.
Yes, exactly. And so I just thought it was really cool because in the Northwest, the 1950s was the nascent environmental movement. And of course, then it was called conservation movement. And it had been around since John Muir, but it hadn't become the kind of popular cause that it later became. And Douglas, as a famous and high-profile proponent of conservation, helped to drive it into the public sphere in ways that had not been done before, and certainly not with the kind of media attention.
The importance of this hike to our nation was recognized by newspapers, magazines, radio, and television stations.
So what was the purpose of the beach hike in the first place?
The hike came about because the state of Washington was considering building a coastal highway on the Washington coast. And the longest and last stretch of undeveloped coastline in the United States basically ran from Nia Bay to the Hoh River. And a key chunk of that was from Lake Ozette to La Push, or Rialto Beach, just outside La Push. And there were environmentalists nationally who were concerned about this. You know, we've got to protect this natural coastline. I mean, there's plenty up in Alaska, but in terms of the lower 48, this is it.
This is the wildest and I think the most picturesque beach area of our country's whole coastline.
So a group of environmentalists here let Douglas know about it. He had done this previously in other places where he had led a hike. And Douglas envisioned it as, I'm going to bring proponents of the road and opponents, and we're going to hike this 22-mile stretch in 3 days. And this will be a chance to show people what's endangered, but also have a debate, have a talk about it.
Do roads have to go everywhere? Must we pave all the wilderness trails? Can't we have 1% of the woods and the beaches for those who love wildness?
Who was in favor of this highway, and what would they get out of it?
Well, I think it was favored by many of the business community and tourism community on the Olympic Peninsula. Oregon had a highway all along its coast. Why couldn't we have the same thing here? It would open access to more people. It would bring in tourist dollars. You would have businesses and resorts and whatnot along the coast, and this would be a good thing. And I think there had long been struggles with Olympic National Park, as an example, taking up too much potential logging wilderness. The sense was, well, other people in the city have decided that the Olympic Peninsula must be preserved for their enjoyment, but what about those of us who live here, make a living in these forests?
I can't imagine a road there right now. Having hiked out to Cape of Lava, for instance, I can't imagine crossing a highway at any point during that hike.
Well, you know, there's a reason you can't imagine it. It's because it didn't happen. So the hike was conceived as, and the headline, here's a headline from the Seattle Times, Justice Douglas Party Finish Protest Hike. And there was no bones that it was a protest hike. Douglas had wanted to have both pro and anti-highway people on this hike to show them how beautiful it was and make converts.
We all walked along the hard-packed sand in the warm glow of the setting sun, thankful for all this beauty.
The people who wanted a highway said, heck with that.
We'll drive.
Yeah, we'll drive. And so Douglas was the front man for this, but it was a lot of wilderness and local conservationists who did the work of actually putting the whole hike together. And key among those was a woman who became a major figure in the Northwest environmental movement, a woman named Polly Dyer. She later said that this was probably one of the very first things she organized. She was a behind-the-scenes person. She's actually in the documentary. I've seen photographs where she's kind of on the edge of the picture. But she was really the grassroots nuts and bolts person who organized it. So you had roughly, I think the party was about 70 people. It's a 3-day hike. It's not a particularly easy hike because of the coastal ups and downs and the tides and whatnot. I found this funny description which brought up sort of memories of hiking back in that era. And it says local organizers, mainly Polly Dyer, took care of logistics and other planning for the hike. Dyer instructed hikers to bring a Trapper Nelson packboard, sleeping bag, insect repellent, deodorant, rain hat, matches dipped in wax, and an assortment of food and drink. And I just love that picture because that's how we hiked in the old days.
That's old-timey.
Right?
That's old school
the matches
hiking.
dipped in wax.
And we had a bite of food called gorp.
You're going to have to explain what a Trapper Nelson packboard is.
So, a Trapper Nelson packboard is a backpack that had two boards that went up the side and was tied to a canvas flat pack, and then you had a canvas bag that was then tied to that. It was invented, I think, in the 1920s or 30s here in the Northwest, in the Seattle area.
It's like wearing a miniature ladder on your back, right?
Yes, that's a good way to describe it. So I love that passage about what these folks are told to bring.
And it's interesting when you watch the film, not just the packs, but the clothing. It really sets the period. That looks exactly like our family on our hikes and our camping trips.
Yeah, there's no special rain pants. A lot of the people are hiking in tennis shoes. No Gore-Tex, none of the super fabrics that they make today.
Well, getting back to Polly Dyer, I'm fascinated with her because it sounds like she really was a mover and shaker in a lot of work about the environment and conservation and preservation, but we don't really hear a lot about her. There's no buildings named after her. There's no trails named after her that I know. Why is that?
I think the answer is that she was not a public figure in the way that William O. Douglas was. She was willing to let someone more visible, more powerful, be out front. She was an inside person in many respects, behind the scenes. The fact that she is to the side of these photos of this beach hike, I think, is very significant. But she's, been honored. People within the environmental movement, they all know who she is, who she was.
Polly Dyer is a Seattle conservationist and environmentalist who has spent more than 60 years working to preserve the state of Washington's wilderness.
She's been written about in books and that kind of thing. But I think she's most meaningful to the people who were in these fights. And I think she also recognized that it's hard for a person to take sole credit, right? These are mass movements, organized. But she was an amazing figure because she was somebody who could play at all levels. So she moved here with her husband from California in 1950 or so. And they were avid outdoors people. They joined the mountaineers. They were going out recreating. She had been involved in California in the Sierra Club. She had a lot of contacts there. She had done some work, volunteer work for them. And when she moved up here, she was really interested in wilderness preservation. She focused at first and for many, many years on the Olympic Peninsula and Olympic National Park because there were debates going on over what should be part of the park, and could other new areas of the coast be brought into park protection? So there was still a lot of discussion and a lot of pushback of logging interests and whatnot. So it was definitely a hot spot. It still is in many ways. Things there are still very contested. She worked at the University of Washington's Institute for Environmental Studies for many years. And when she retired from that job in the mid-90s, Seattle Times did a profile of her, and I want to just read a little bit from that. If Polly Dyer hadn't moved to Washington in 1950, environmentalists say, the state map might look a lot different today. No North Cascades National Park, no wilderness areas, for that matter, no Wilderness Act. Olympic National Park might not include the rainforests. Backpackers who hike the park's wild coastal strip, longest roadless coastline in the lower 48, might share that shore with cars. Dyer played a big role in all of those fights. And there's another quote in that story which I thought was really funny. And this is said by a guy named Dick Fiddler, who was a club leader of the Sierra Club in Seattle at the time. John Muir founded the Sierra Club in 1893, and most of the rest of us can't figure out how he did it without Polly. So she had a home with a big living room. She had endless meetings there, grassroots organizing, bringing other organizations together to work on issues. She actually drafted part of the Wilderness Act.
So it sounds like she was politically connected with Scoop and Maggie and the congressional delegations. So she had connections there.
Yes, and she was a very early and strong supporter of Dan Evans, a Republican governor who elected in 1964, who was about as green as you can get. He'd grown up here too. He'd been a Boy Scout. He was an avid outdoors person. And Polly had a great relationship with him. She was also working with Scoop Jackson and Warren G. Magnuson. And they were, the muscle that was getting legislation in Washington, D.C. together to help create North Cascades National Park, to pass the Wilderness Act. And she was widely recognized as, the great activist, the great connector, the organizer who really drove that machine for many years.
In 1957, Mrs. Dyer was one of the founders of the North Cascades Conservation Council and led the intense lobbying and public relations campaign to establish North Cascades National Park. She also testified before Congress that year in favor of the Wilderness Act, which would protect more than 100 million acres of wilderness.
How tough was that fight over the North Cascades National Park? How close did we come to not having that area?
Well, it was actually a long battle to get it recognized. The North Cascades Conservation Council, she was on their board for 60 years. So that tells you something about starting as a little grassroots organization, getting it passed, and then continuing to watchdog. And there are still issues related to North Cascades. I mean, we did an episode recently about the possibility of grizzlies being reintroduced into the North Cascades. One reason is it's one of the only places left in the lower 48 that is untrammeled, which was a favorite word of Polly Dyer's, untrammeled, where a significant grizzly population could live and used to be there.
As our hike neared its end, I recalled why we had all come, from all corners of our nation. To enjoy the beach, of course, but also to protest a plan for building a highway along this wild, untrammeled beach.
So the hike was successful. What happened after the hike?
Well, one thing is at the end of the 1958 beach hike, so they're at Rialto Beach, they're greeted by a protester and his son, and they have signs made up. And the signs say things like, "Birdwatcher, go home." That's my favorite one. I mean, and it was actually near Rialto Beach that Douglas had a little campsite, piece of property that he owned. So he felt like he was a local. Anyway, it turns out that protester was actually a major figure within the Auto Club of Washington. And these were among the people who were promoting this road. So he wasn't just a rando. He was somebody who was involved. Douglas thought this was wonderful. I mean, he responded with grace, but he was delighted because you have a documentary filmmaker, you have a bunch of newspaper reporters on this hike, and here's a moment of conflict. Here's a great period to put on the thing. This is what we're up against. So Douglas was really thrilled by that, but the issue didn't go away.
There was no highway built.
There was no highway built there, but there was a desire to maybe reconnect some other parts of the coast and build a highway through some of the reservations and whatnot on the coast. And so it came up again. And so Douglas headed a new beach hike in 1964. And it was really well covered. I mean, I went through the Times and the PI, and they each sent a photographer and a writer and did like almost daily stories updating this beach hike. This beach hike was not as long as the first one. I think it was more like 15 miles in 3 days.
Same location?
No, it was south. It was basically south of La Push down to the Hoh.
Was there any film made of this hike?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen any.
Photos?
Yes, there are photographs, but the hike was miserable in terms of the rain. It just did what, it was held at the same time of year, August, And in the first beach hike, they just had magically wonderful weather the whole way. In the second beach hike, it was the classic, pouring rain.
Well, 1 out of 2, 50-50. That's the way it goes.
Yep. But it's interesting because we were talking about coast roads. So I found this clipping from 1985, and there was another proposal to build a coast road through the Quinault Indian Reservation, and then they wanted to tie Ocean Shores and the coastline south of there with a coast road. And then they also envisioned bridging Willapa Bay, putting a bridge across Willapa Bay that would connect the Long Beach Peninsula. And this thing ended up getting shot down as well. But, 1958, 1964, 1985, and there were a lot of supporters on the coast, many of the same people who would have loved to have seen this other road go in, who were supportive of this, the same kinds of, timber interests, tourist interests, auto interest, and whatnot. But it ended up being kind of an idea that was floated and quickly shot down.
So the 58 hike and the 1964 hike killed the plans by themselves, that they were that instrumental?
I can't say that's the only reason, but the plans were scuttled shortly thereafter. They were shelved. Now, the highway department rarely shelves anything. They often will come back. Bridging islands in Puget Sound is another thing that always seems to come back every 10 years or so. It's like, let's build a bridge to Bainbridge or whatever.
Well, if our ferry system gets much worse, that plan may resurface, not to make a pun. Do we know what the various native tribes on the Olympic Peninsula were thinking about this highway, the Makah, the Quileute, or the Quinault?
I didn't find much of that in the press coverage. And at the time, I don't think the media were particularly looking at those issues. The wilderness movement, the conservation movement, tended to talk about these areas as being untouched, pristine. And we know that human beings living on the Washington coast since time immemorial, trading, harvesting. At Cape Alava, there was an enormous Makah village. So we know that these areas were tremendously important to the peoples who lived there and continue to be today, and they steward over them. They're very much a part of the cultural history and cultural present and cultural landscape of the tribes along what would have been that road route.
Well, as I mentioned before, I can't imagine a highway in that area. I've hiked and camped, especially at Cape Alava, and explored those areas, and it's so peaceful. It's so just being able to walk from the trailhead through this unbelievable forest to the water, camping right under the trees, right above the beach. There's nothing like it. And to wonder what that would be like if you could hear road sounds, tires on a road, cars going by, even from a distance, it just wouldn't be the same at all.
No, it wouldn't be the same. It's Cape Alava's the westernmost point of the lower 48. And I remember camping out there probably right around the time I wrote William O. Douglas, actually. And I had this feeling of like, I'm the last person in America to watch the sun go down.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. The video series is now in its 9th season. A new episode airs on Cascade PBS every Thursday night through May. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.